Hey everyone, so first things first, I'm using the default VR template that's now provided in 4.27. The reason I'm using 4.27 specifically in this case is because it currently has access to the OpenXR content folders. So we can access the controller meshes and add sockets to those so we can do interactions later on. Currently, UE5 doesn't currently have access to that OpenXR folder, so it makes it more difficult to do widget interactions or basically Niagara particles, which I want to cover. You can still use Unreal Engine 5 and any other version previously of Unreal to do all of this and what we're going to cover. I will be using the Oculus Quest 2 for demoing this because we're going to cover a lot of VR content, but it can actually be done for third person, first person characters. We just need to add the HUD in a different way, which I'll also show you once we start. First thing we're going to do is actually create a new level, and we're going to start there so we can cover some of the simple stuff. So when it comes to VR, a health and safety screen is pretty much number one. So we're going to start there because it allows us to focus on 2D widgets as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new level, and I'm going to set it up so our player is in there. We can do that by right-clicking, maps, or level, and then m_. Let's do health and safety. Let's open this up. And I'm going to speed through this pretty quick. So we're going to drop in a cube, center it. So we've got a floor. Then going to add a player start. And then center that. Make sure it's just about clipping into the floor. And then we're going to set the auto receive input here on the right hand side to player 0. And because we're just covering UMG, I'm just going to add in a sky real quickly. So I'm going to show engine content, sky, drag and drop that in there, add a directional light. If we were to press play now, nothing would happen because we don't have a game mode set up for our level. So we can go to our edit, project settings, maps and modes. Oh, we've already got VR game mode, so if we play, we might actually be good to. Yep, so we've got our controllers. That's good. So in this case, I actually want the sky to be black, so we want a full black background. So I think we might actually change this. So I'm going to search for the sky sphere, because if we have a look at this, we can zoom out and we can see it from the outside. So the faces are flipped inwards, which allows us to have another mesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this to a geometry folder, which we already have. Make sure we copy it, geometry. And then we want to create a materials folder. We've already got one. Let's do new material and underscore background. Colors all 1. And then I'm going to just make this black. So constant 3 vector using 3. Roughness, we'll have it as 1. And we'll hit apply. This is going to make it nicer for us to read. So now that we have that, we can save, close it down. And we can actually delete the sky now. So delete the sky, go to geometry, drag in our sky sphere, and we'll center it up. And now we can actually add our black material to it. So we get our black background. You see we've got weird reflections. This is actually from the sun or the directional light. So in the material, I'm just going to set this to unlit. So default lit, unlit, and then we hit apply. That updates to a pure black. And we're going to set our floor to be not visible. So now when we press start, we have a pure black screen. And we can see our controllers. Add in a skylight. Center that as well. So now that we have our player in a pure black background, we can actually start looking at creating some widgets. So first thing we're going to do is create a new folder in our contents called UMG. That's just going to allow us to keep track of everything much easier. So UMG, we're going to open this up. And in this case, the first thing we're going to create is a user interface. So we can right click, user interface, and then widget blueprint. And a widget blueprint is going to be our UI essentially, or our UMG, which is Unreal Motion Graphics. So we're going to look into that. So I'm going to call this widget blueprint underscore health and safety. This just allows us to know what it is. And just so we can see what's in there, we're going to literally add just drag some text in. And we're going to set our anchor points to center. I'll cover this in a little bit. And we'll center our text. And we just want to make it big just so we can see it in our scene. And I'm going to keep it white, hit compile and save. So now is the point where we want to add it to our screen. We have a widget. We need to add it to our viewport. And there's two different ways to do this. For third person and first person games, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to add it to the screen as though you were doing a third person or a first person player. That way, if you're following along for that, you'll know how to do it. And I'm actually going to use our VR pawn for this. And this will be a good example of why not to do it if you're working with VR. You'll be able to put this on and try it out. So first thing we're going to do is do a custom event. And we call this create HUD. Or actually, we'll do create UMG because we're going to do a HUD later on. We're going to drag off and do create widget. And for our class, we're going to choose our health and safety screen that we put in there. We're then going to store or promote to a variable. So we have a reference to that UMG we've just created. And then we would typically add to viewport. So add to viewport, like so. It's brought in both references. We don't need that. And now we can just fire our create UMG. And I'm going to do that with our event begin play. Drag off here and let's add a sequence for now. So drag off, do create UMG. And plug this one back up so everything fires like normal. So now if we hit save or file and save all, and then we jump back into our game, once we press play and we select viewport, you see our text is added to our screen. So that's as simple as it is to add your UMG to your first person or third person player. But the issue is if you put your headset on now, if you're working with VR, you should get a weird effect where the text is pretty much in between both eyes, so you can't actually see it. So here, all I can see is CK and then TE because of the way it's positioned on the screen. It's between the lenses. And you can also see that the text on the screen has moved over to the right. This is where it becomes more difficult to display UMG onto a VR headset, but it's not actually that difficult. So first thing I'm going to do is actually delete this create UMG because we don't need to hook this back up. Delete those, and I'm going to delete the reference as well. File and save, and then we're going to jump back in. And now to add a UMG to our level for our VR player, we've got two options. We could either add it to our screen directly, so we could have it as a child of our camera, or we can do a 3D widget, which we can place into the scene, which is what I'm going to do here. So with this, we can right click and do a blueprint class, actor, do BP underscore health, and actually we'll do BP underscore UMG display because we can actually reuse this as we go through. So we're going to open this up. What you want to do is you want to go add component and then search widget. And you see here we've got two different components. We have widget and then widget. By default, our player already has a widget interaction, which is what allows us to interact with widgets in the VR template, especially the menu that comes with it. So we want a widget. And what we can do here is we can select it, and then on widget class, we can actually choose the health and safety screen widget, and you see it adds it in. But the issue here is it's cut off. And the reason for that is we're telling the draw size of our widget that we're only at 500 by 500 pixels, when in reality, if we open up our widget blueprint itself, our screen size is actually 1280 by 720. It can be tempting to actually go in and set our resolution to 1280 by 720. But what I actually do is I straight up just set this to 1920 by 1080. And then that fits our text. We can hit compile. And now if we jump back to our viewport, what we can do is we can drag in our BP UMG display into our scene. We'll need to rotate it around. It's facing the wrong way. 180, and I'm going to line this up. So that's pretty much right now on top of our player. So we're going to move this back. And here is where I just typically rescale our widget. And I actually do 0.3 by default. I actually find this a nice size, which you can then bring closer and forward depending on what you want to do with it. Make sure to have the blueprint itself selected. So now if we jump into VR, we actually have our 3D widget in the scene in front of us. So now we can actually look at adding some information to this. What we're going to do now is actually create our health and safety screen, and it's going to look like this. So we have a logo with text that we can edit and position, so we can actually have something to look at and update as we want. And you see here when I stop, it actually resets the default because all of the text that's being set is being done procedurally at runtime using a struct. So I'll move that back over to the side. First thing we're going to do is actually open up our health and safety screen, and we're going to have a look at what we've got in here. So this is our UMG layout. We have a palette on the left, which contains useful presets essentially that we can modify and update as we want. So we got borders, buttons, checkboxes, images, name slots, progress bars, rich text options, sliders, text, you name it, it's pretty much here. We won't be able to cover everything in this tutorial, but I'll cover as much of the necessary stuff as possible. So just have a play around with some of these and have a look at how they can be used, and you should be able to pick it up from what we covered today. So the first thing I actually want to cover in depth really is our anchor points, because they can confuse quite a lot of people. So what an anchor point is the location of some things attached to on the screen. This mainly comes into play when working with 2D or third person, as you might have different size displays and you want your UMG and your HUD to scale dynamically with that, with the user's UMG who's playing your game. For example, if we've got a health bar, we might want it attached to the top of the screen. So if their screen size changes based on their height, it'll actually always stay at the top of the screen. And to do that, you would then choose anchor, and you would choose the top middle one here. So you can see it's changed. Our text is anchored at the top. So no matter whereabouts this line is or their screen, it will always be in the same place. But when working with VR, I actually just stick with the center. And what this allows us to do is position it wherever we want, and it will always be correct based on the 3D widgets we use, as most headsets have the same or will use the same UMG size that we go for. And in my case, I typically stick with 1920 by 1080, as it's just easier to understand and it works better in my head when using Photoshop to build UMGs. So based on whereabouts you want your information or your text boxes to be on the screen, that is what you would change to match that. So centering text. So you can see here I've been playing around with this and trying to line it up. And if I reset our values to 0, 0, 0, you see it doesn't center. We've got to manually select it, drag it around, and try and line it up as good as we can get it. And this, it's just a pain. But what you can do is if you're working with 1920 by 1080 and your anchor point is centered, you can set alignment to actually to be 0.5. It's 0.5. And once you reset these to 0, they'll actually center up. So it'll use that center point to work out where you're going. And then you can use the position Y and position X to actually move their location relative to where we want to go. So this will be our title, or we can use it as our title. So I'm going to shrink our text size down to about 30. And I'm going to use size to content. And what that does is it moves our box to dynamically adjust for our text. So it just makes it easier. So you see if I change the font size, it scales with it. When it comes to Z order, you don't really need to worry about this. This is basically to do with the render order. So in old Word documents, you could right click a photo and you could center back, or you can center front. This is essentially the same thing, but for widgets. So you can change the order. And we see here the order priority this widget is rendered in. Higher values are rendered last, so they will appear to be on top. So it works back to front. Same as the hierarchy here, actually. If you're used to stuff like Photoshop or something like that, you would think that you would put the stuff to go to the back on the bottom of the list and the stuff to go on the front, or yeah, at the front, at the top of the list, when in fact it's actually the other way around. So we'll have a look at that more in a little bit. But for now, we're going to have a look at how we can actually modify this text. So with it selected, we can select our text block. And we can call this title, because that's what it's going to be. And you can see we can update the text here and go through and modify it to be whatever we want. So we can say title and then hello, UMG. So you get the point. We can update our text using this box. But the thing is, if you're modifying text as you go or in your widgets, you might find that you want to update it later on. Then you've got to find the widget, you've got to find the text box, and then you've got to go through that way. That can become quite a hassle. So I'm going to show you how you can actually use a struct to populate this text at runtime so you can have more control over it. And you can even have other things control what that text says. And we'll look at this later on when we cover bindings as well. But for now, we've got our text, and then we have our color and opacity and our fonts. These are pretty much self-explanatory. You can change the color of your UMG using the color and opacity. Font, we can add fonts, and we can add it here. We'll look at adding custom fonts in a little bit. And then typeface, you got bold, italic, same stuff as normal, as well as size. So let's set this to 45, keep it uniform. We don't have a font material, and we're not going to be using one for this, as it's part of our font family of Roboto. So if we select this magnifying glass, you see how we've got Roboto here, and every font has a material preset. It's actually easier to show if I search for and then drag this into the scene. You'll see on the right here, we actually have a default text material opaque. This is what it uses by default. So we don't need to worry about that. And we then have strike, brush, shadow offset, and shadow color. You don't really need to worry about these because you probably do custom fonts anyway. That's fine. Justification is whether it's left, centered, or right. Alignment, same as normal. And then you've got margins, which you probably won't touch that much. If we scroll down, we have auto wrap text. We will actually look at this and enable it in a little bit when we do our main paragraph. But what this does is basically allows once our text hits the end of our box, it'll just wrap down and it'll automatically populate for us. So you don't have to do Shift Tab and Shift Enter to add line breaks. We then have our behaviors. Typically, tooltips text, you could add a little bit of information there about what it does when you hover your mouse over a widget or your pointer. You probably don't have to add any of that in there, to be fair, unless it gets really complicated and you need something like these to pop up. So you can see here it says tooltip, text to show when the user hovers over a widget with the mouse. It's essentially the same thing as what we've got right here. We then have is enabled. By default, that's true, and we'll probably just leave it like that. And then we've got visibility. Visibility will come into play later on when we want to hide and show widgets. But you can see here we've got visible, collapsed, hidden, not hit testable, self and all children, as well as not hit testable, self only. What that means is if it's not hit testable, we won't actually be able to interact with it. It'll be kind of like disabled. So we're going to leave that as visible for now. And then transform and pivot, probably won't touch these. And everything else is pretty much as it should be. So that's a pretty brief rundown of the details panel and what we get. And this does change based on what it is you're interacting with. For example, if I drag in an image, you see here we get a brush, which we can add images to. And we'll use this in a minute. We also have our timeline and animations at the bottom of the screen. So if we want to animate anything to do with our widgets, we can do that here. And we'll also look at this later on when we get to it. What we're going to do now is actually look at setting up our health and safety screen. We're going to have an image, title, paragraph box, and then a press any button to advance. We won't be setting that up in this video. We're going to be having our image, which is going to be our warning logo, a title, an information box, and then a press any button to advance. So it's going to look like our scene here. So we got our health and safety warning, our description, our information, and then our press any key. And what we've got is we actually have this running through a construction. We actually have this all set through a struct. So if I stop this and then I change the title that we have here, so UMG tutorial, we've made our change. We can hit enter, and you can see it updates here. And we hadn't had to actually go into our UMG, so this can save a lot of time when working on stuff. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. So let's undo that so I don't break it. And the first thing we need to do is actually set up our UMG. So first thing we've got is an image. So we're going to drag this in. And alignment, we're going to set to 0.5 by 0.5, just so we can center it easier. So we can see here we do 0, 0, we center it. And you'll notice that it actually positions to our anchor point. That's our center. And if you remember what I said at the beginning, we're going to have it so it's always at the center. So we're going to change that again. And then we can reset this to the center position. And now what we can do is we can just drag this up and place it above our text or a title. So I'm going to do this as a whole number, so minus 400. And here I'm actually going to change our image size to 50 by 50. You'll see that hasn't updated. That's because we don't have an image in there. But what you can do, if you want this to match for now, you could actually change the size X and the size Y. So we might actually need to go to about 250 by 250 and then bring our text down like so. It's a bit big, but we can play around with this. Let's do, this is the fun stuff about UMG. It's all experimental. You can just play around and get what you want going. So we can drag our title up. And now we're going to add our information box, which is going to contain our paragraph about what we're trying to tell the user or information about our game. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to plan in my head how I want this to be laid out and how it could be designed. Typically, you would have a design document, like a UMG design document, which would teach you your user interface, so your UX, UI design, and then you would use that to influence your UMG setup. But for now, we just need another box, and we can actually select our title. So you see here we've got title, we can right click, we can duplicate, and it'll snap to our centered, and we still have our values. So now all we've got to do is position it where we want it. And I'm going to position this just under our title, and I'm going to remove size to content because this could vary based on what it is we put in here in the information. I'm also going to set our size for our text to about 30, so it's a little bit smaller. And then drag the box down, and I'm going to change the size of it. So it's 400, and I'm going to bring it in a little bit because we don't want our text to go all the way to the end. If you remember, once we type this out, so if I just start randomly typing into here, and we just go all the way to the end, just keep going, you'll see that it goes outside of our box. But what we can do is we can scroll down, and we can select auto wrap text, and we'll see nothing actually happens. The reason for this is because it's done by word. So you could actually go to this drop down here, and you could change wrapping policy, allow per character wrapping. You'll see that automatic wrap box. Or typically when you're writing a sentence, this would be default. And then once you add spaces in, so let's go through and we'll just add a few spaces here and there. And once we press enter, you'll see that it automatically wraps based on the spaces in the word. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I'm going to reset this text to just say information. So we've got our information box set up. We've got it scaled correctly or how we'd like it. And what we can do now is actually add in our website or basically extra information. You can go here to get it. And that's essentially the same thing. We just want to duplicate our text box. We want to center it up using our position X and Y. And then we want to reposition this lower down. And I'm going to drag this bottom bit up. So we have our information. And I'm just going to call this website. And that's all we need to do here. And we're going to duplicate this one and do the exact same thing. Center, position, and then move it down. And we'll have this read, press any button to advance. We'll set this to advanced text. Excellent. So now that we have our information boxes and it's all set up how we want it, the thing that we need to do now is actually populate this with information. But if you've been keeping a really close eye on UMG or what I've been doing, you'll see that we have on our left here, we've got text, title, text information, text website, text advanced. This is pretty bad practice because the reason is we don't know what it is these text boxes do. So if we jump over to our graph, you'll see that we don't have them here. But if we want to edit this information, we've got to go to designer and we want to select one of these and make a variable. So we'll do is variable, and we're going to do this for all of them. And we'll be able to see that once we make these public, we just have text block 0, and text block 1. So we don't actually know what any of this does. Like, we're not going to use this now. We're not going to use these variables now in this example, but keep that in mind. Like, you really need to, as you add these in, start renaming the top bits. And I find title, or basically what it is, and then underscore txt is a really good way of doing this, as it gives you an idea of what it is your variables are. But in this case, I'm going to go through and I'm going to name these as it is. So we actually have all these wrote in there now. And this is just really good habit and practice to get into. So I recommend doing that with all of these, even if you don't use them as a variable or have them accessible. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to make sure all of these are set to not variable, because I'm going to show you how you can modify the text in these without being variables. So we're going to hit compile and save. And I'm actually going to go back to our main screen. And we're going to create a new contents folder. And I'm going to call this Structs. And this is basically going to store our information. So we're going to open this up. And we're going to go to Blueprints. And we're going to create a struct here. And what a struct is basically a list of information we can access and use to populate different things within our game. So we're going to call this S for struct underscore health and safety info. Like, you could actually have this as just a UMG. So you could have struct underscore UMG, and all of your UMG information could be populated from this one struct. So if you need to go through and change anything, you could. But if you've never used a struct before or worked with it, it's essentially a variable list that we can access and change in here. So for example, in our widget blueprint, we have text, and we also have what we would think would be an image, because that's what this is called, image underscore row 1, but it's not. What we want to do is we want to actually access the brush information. And you can see here it's got a bind little box, a little drop down box called bind. And this means this is what we're after. We want a brush. So we're going to do this in order. So we're going to select our struct. We're going to change our boolean to a brush. And we want a slate brush. So a brush which contains information about how to draw a slate element. So we're going to select this, and we're going to call this safety icon. And you can see here it's changed to a safety icon and a drop down with the little square that matches our brush here. And when we do the drop down, we can actually access this information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a image for our health and safety logo. And then once I've brought this into Unreal, I'll show you what to do with that. So I found a logo, and because organization is super critical when working on a project, we're actually going to contents, or we could go to our VR template and materials folder. Oh, we can see actually we've got a textures folder here. We're actually going to use this textures folder. So we're going to right click, new folder. We'll call this icons. We'll open this folder up, and I'm just going to drag in the PNG logo. And the reason I've done PNG is because we don't want a background on our image. So now we can actually go to our health and safety, struct, and we can drag in our widget or our image, and we can add it in there. We can see the scale is 1100 or 1169 by 1024. We can actually change this to be something around 500 by 500. We're going to keep everything as it is. And then we're going to go to our, and then we're going to dock it. We'll make sure we minimize that. And now we can go through and add the rest of our text. So we've got a title, and that is a, and now that we have our title added in, we can actually set this to text, because that's what we're populating. It is actually text. And if we hold Control Alt, you'll see that a text variable is used for localized text. You should do this if your text will be ever shown to the user, so it can be translated to different languages. So text is what you want. You don't want to use a string or anything, you want to use a text. So we're going to set it to text, that's our title. And we're not going to populate these yet, we're just going to go through and we're going to set these up in order. So we've got information, websites, and then we've got our advanced. Excellent. So now we can actually populate this information. So our title is going to say health and safety. So health and safety warning. Our information is going to say read and follow all warnings and instructions included in the headset before use. Headset should be calibrated for each user, and then not for use by children under the age of 7. Stop the experience if you feel discomfort or health reactions in general. So just a general overview of what someone should do in the case if they feel sick while using the headset and what they should do before they start. So every VR game should have this, so make sure you put it in there, as it could save somebody a lot of time at the beginning. So our website, we know the Oculus website actually has more information on this topic, so we can actually select their website and just paste that in there. So I'm going to copy and paste this over from my other one. So this just says more www.oculus.com/warnings. And then we're going to have our advanced say, press any key to acknowledge. So we're going to hit compile and save. So we've got all our information set. And now we go to our health and safety screen, we have nothing. And if we press play, I'm just going to simulate for now. So if I press play, I experience a crash for some reason. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to carry on to the rest of it. So what we want to do is we actually have our struct information set up here. But if we open up our UMG, where we want to actually populate the information, we don't actually have any way to access that. So what we want to do is we just want to go to our graph. And all we're going to do is go to variables. And we're just going to add in our structs that we created. So we'll call this health and safety info. And on our drop down, it's currently set to bool, which is going to search s underscore health and safety. And you see we get our s health and safety info populated here. If we hit compile, we can see on the bottom here, we actually have all of our information. And this is what we're going to use to populate our graph. So since we have our health and safety info struct inside of our variables list, there's 3 ways we can actually populate information with inside of our UMG. We've already looked at one of those, which is inside the designer, and that is to set all the information here. So for example, we can find our logo, we can select it here. And what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to show you how to change this to work with UMG a little bit better, because you might experience some pixelation when you bring those in. So what you want to do is hit the magnifying glass and open up your texture. And you'll be greeted with this window here. What you want to do is on compression settings, you want to change this to user interface 2D. And then for our texture group, we also want to set this to UI. What that'll do is it'll change the level of detail in the image, so it'll stop being pixelated based on scale and stuff. And it's just an easier way to get sharper images when working with UMG. So I'm going to do that one for there. The title, we can go through and we can add the health and safety information into here as well. And this is really good to do if you don't plan on changing any of the information. So in this case, normally once you're doing a health and safety screen, you would add all this information here. So it'd be health, and then you could do and safety, and you can have that listed in here like so, because you'll only be going into this once and you'll be updating there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you another 2 ways of doing it. One, procedurally, so it will change at runtime, which is very expensive, so you don't want to do that all that much. And then another way with blueprints, and that's what I'm going to do first. So first thing I'm going to do is go to our graph. And if you remember, we've got our health and safety struct, but we don't have access to our other variables. For example, our image, our title, or information. So what we want to do is we want to select our images or our entire list, and then go through and set these to is variable. And what this will do is it'll allow us to access these inside of our graph. And you'll let us know it'll go a bold white color once this has actually happened, so you can tell the difference between them. So open those up like so. And now back in here, we've got our advanced text, image, information text, title text, website text. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag these in as well as our health and safety. So we're going to get that. And then we're going to drag these in and we're going to set the information using our event construct. so we can actually update the information. So when we press play, it'll have the new stuff from the struct if we change it. It's kind of like procedural generation for UMG, but it only works at runtime, so it's a bit bad for us. And because we're using the pre-construct, we might actually be able to see it before we start, especially if I open up the correct map. So what we can do is we can keep that there. And from our struct, because it contains more information than we've actually got for our pins, we want to drag off our blue pin and do break S health and safety info. And you can see here now we've got access to all of that information inside of our struct. So advanced text, we're going to drag this in, we're going to get, and from this we want to set text. So we've got widget, set text, brackets text, and then we can just connect this to our advanced, and we can hook it up like so. It's good practice to put these in order, so it would be good to do it the same way. So we'll start with the safety icon and we'll change this around. So image, we want to drag in and get. And if you remember, it was a brush. So we want to set brush. And then we can actually plug that straight into our icon. So now if we move this up, plug it in like so. I think if we press compile and save and then we have a look, we can see that it's actually updated our logo, but it hasn't done it for our set advanced text. So we'll have a look at that in a minute. And I'm just going to go through and I'm going to do the same thing. So set brush, image. I don't think we need image. I don't know which one that is. Oh, image is our actual image. That's right. So advanced text, we've got our second one. Information, which I believe is spelled wrong. It is very spelled wrong. So don't worry about that. So set text again. Information. And we might as well leave that off. So title, get title, or set text. And like I said, we're going to put these in order. Title, and then website. So drag that in, get text. If I can grab this one, plug that in like so. Website. Hook that up, hit compile and save. And now when we simulate, we actually have all of our text and information already in here for us. So rather than being set on tick continuously, the way the procedural set will work, this is actually only done once when the game starts. So we can then go in and change our struct again and update this information without opening up our widget blueprint, having to go to designer and then have to retype it all out in here. So you can see it's already added it as well. So it sets it in the actual text stuff. So you can do that at runtime, which is a good way of doing it. So it's like using blueprints to populate this information. So it's done once, which is great for us. So that's exactly what we want. So now onto the procedural side of it. And what we're going to do for that is we're actually going to use these binds. So it's important to note that a bind is the equivalent of a function. It's something that fires on tick and it constantly runs. So it can get quite performance heavy, especially if there's no information being updated or sent to it in real time. There's quite little that I can think of that you would actually use this for, as you could actually set up custom events to fire these widgets to update the text. So rather than using the functions of the binds, I'd suggest avoiding them. But saying that, I'm going to show you how to do it anyway. So we're going to go to our graph, and if we're doing a procedural, I'm going to delete all of this to show that we're not using any blueprints or anything like that to set it. We go to designer, and you see that that's all gone back to normal. I'm going to actually set our logo and hit compile, so it should update and disappear. Excellent. So now we're back to our bare bones widget. But if we want to do this procedurally, we can use something called binds. And like I said, these are the equivalent of a function that run on event tick. So they're always looking to be updated and they always want new information almost every frame. So if you're working in VR or mobile VR specifically, and mobile devices, it can be very, very expensive to use. So you should not do this unless you have a very specific reason for doing so. I'm going to show you anyway, just because it's the whole point of this. And the easiest way to do this is to use binds. So in our graph, we have our struct. We already know that. What we want to do is go to our brush. We can select bind, and you can see here we've actually got our struct accessible. So we select safety icon, title. We're going to go to bind for our text. We're going to select our health and safety variable, and then we can go to title. We're going to do the same thing for information all the way down. Website, health and safety, website, and then advanced text. So now, once we compile, we don't see anything here, but if we go back to our health and safety screen, we get it updated. And now if we open up our struct, which actually has access to all of our information, we can see that we can actually change this in real time. So as soon as we change something, we press enter, we see that it updates. We could change the logo. Let's put some weird icon on. It's not going to work because it's not a texture, I don't think. There it is. So for some reason, the brushes don't update immediately, but once you press play, they do update and then they're there. So that's just one, that's another way of adding that information. So now that we've done this, I'm going to back up all the way through till we have our code back in our graph, because this is the way that we actually want to do it. So I just done Control Z to get all the way back here. Compile, save, designer, save, and then if we press play, it updates again and goes back. Not too sure why we're updating the icon. Did we not change the bind? No. Oh, it's because we set the image here. So let's find our T-warning logo. Compile, save. And now we have it updating still. Okay, so what's going on here? Let's figure that out. So that updated again. Compile. So if we just do compile, it automatically goes back to the tick. I wonder if there's some kind of bug. Yeah, it doesn't seem to like that. Safety icon. I don't think I changed it in our struct, did I? Nope. So we still got our struct and we're updating our logo. So I wonder if there's some kind of bug in here to do with our designer. So let's set this to something else. Right, that doesn't work. So now let's try our logo. Nope, it really likes that tick. And we've got no binding. It just won't update. Okay, so there must be something with brushes in this version, so I'm going to delete that. Yes, because it's reference to code. And I'm just going to drag this back in real quick. So 150 by 150. Our alignment is 0.5, 0.5. And then our anchor point is 0, and then we can center. Move this up. I thought I did 150 by 150. And if you remember, it kept the variable. So that's good. So we can drag in our image, connect that back up. So now hopefully once we press play, it's still a tick. Okay, let me figure this out. I'll be right back. Okay, so I figured it out. What's going on is there seems to be some kind of bug where in the health and safety variable itself, even though we have it set here, when we save, it's not updating in our widget. So S health and safety, it's just not updating the safety icon. So what I do is go to here. warning, and then change it back to the image. So now once we compile and save, it goes back to exactly what we want. So I was going to skip the press any key to acknowledge part, but I've got a feeling I get so many messages asking how to do it. So let's just cover it all in this one. We'll go a little bit off topic here. So we'll skip through this pretty fast. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Contents, New Folder, Blueprint Interfaces, or we'll just call this Interfaces. If you don't know what a blueprint interface is, I'll have a video linked up in the corner and in the description where you'll be able to follow along and see how these work. So we're going to go to Blueprints. We're going to create a blueprint interface. And I typically actually call this BP open level. So BPI underscore open level. And I'm going to show you why. So we're going to open this up and we're going to create a new function called fade to black. So we're actually going to hook up a open level and a fade to at the same time. And then we want to do fade to scene. Now what I normally do is set up some inputs. So we're going to have quite a few of these. The first being fade duration, which will be a float. We're going to then have a color. And this is actually going to be, you might be tempted to search color, but Unreal's American, so we got to put color. And you might find this one up here. You don't actually want that one. What you want is to use a linear color. Make sure it's linear color because this is going to control a screen fade for our color itself. Gives you more control over it. We're then going to have a Boolean called should fade audio with a question mark. Then another one called should hold audio. And then should open level. And then finally, we're going to have a name. And this is going to be level 2 open. This will all make more sense in a minute. And then for our fade to scene, we're going to want to have fade duration as well. Also a float. For the fade duration, we won't actually be using this in this example because you will need a game instance to have the information transfer between levels. Otherwise, it'll just default back to the 1. But I'm sure you guys can figure that out. So linear color, fade color, should fade audio, question mark, and then should hold audio. I want to make sure those are bools. And we're going to set these to have defaults right here because we won't actually be updating these with a game instance because we just don't have time in this video. But we want to make sure our bools are all false, our fade color is black, and our fade duration, which is the most important one, is set to 1. And for our fade to black, we want to do the same thing. Fade duration is 1, but we can actually control this. Color is black. Should fade audio, yes. And then should hold audio, we want yes. Should open level is going to be false. And for our level to open, we don't actually have a default, so we're going to leave that blank because we'll be populating this in a minute. So now we've got all of that, we can hit compile and save. And what we want to do is actually jump to our VR template, our blueprints, and actually go into our VR pawn. So now that we have our VR player or VR pawn open, what we want to do is go to class settings, add, and we will search for BPI underscore open level. This is what we're going to have control our screen fade and what level to open when we do something. You can have these as individual blueprints, but I find keeping it all inside the player makes it much easier to work with. So now that we added our BPI open level, hit compile, and you see on the left here we've got interfaces, fade to scene, and fade to black. These show us functions, but what we want is the actual events. And if you drag them in, nothing's going to happen. So we can right click, implement event, and then we can right click and we can implement fade to black event. So that gives us access to both of these. And I'm going to put these in order of what would happen. So event fade to scene would happen first. So I'm going to put that on the top. And we're going to get our player camera manager. And then I'm going to search start camera fade. We're going to then hook this up like so. So fade duration to the bottom, fade color to color, should fade audio, and so on. Well, let's tidy this up a little bit. And from our alpha, we're gonna, when we start a level, it should be black and then fade into transparent. So we're gonna have this from alpha 1 set up like so. And what we're actually gonna do is copy our start camera fade to our bottom one. And I'm gonna hook that up like so and make sure our get player camera manager is connected to our target. Otherwise this won't work. So fade duration, color, hook this up, should fade audio, should hold audio. And from alpha, we want to do from 0 to 1. So it goes from transparent to black. And you'll notice in this one that we actually have our should open level and level to open. What we want to do is we want to add a branch, which is going to be our check, should open level, set to true. And if it is, we want to open a level. And we're going to do open level by name. And we're going to connect that up to our level to open. So what happens is we send information through this so we can remotely control whether we fade into black or we fade into the scene. So we can tell other stuff to fade. But if we want to go one step further, we want to fade out and then open a level, we can actually do that with this. So we do a should open level, we check that. We actually want to add a delay between these. So we delay for the duration of our screen fade. So fade duration, which is by default 1 second. And then once that's completed, we just open the new level. So we're going to comment this. So fade and open level, just so we know what we've got here. And before we leave our VR pawn, we want to set our event fade to scene to fire on begin play. So fade to scene, if we scroll up, we should find our event begin play. We want to drag off and then fade to scene. So we drag off to fade to scene, and we want to call function fade to scene, or we could do an interface call, which we'll do here. And then we hook that up like so. So anytime we start our project, we fade for a duration of 1. Our color fade is black. Should fade audio is true, so it'll fade in this time. And then should hold, the music will carry on playing. It won't go back to not having audio. So we compile and save. That's us done for our VR pawn. And we can close our blueprint interface as well. We also don't need our health and safety widget because we've done that. But what we can do now is set up our control. So when we press any key, it actually loads the level. And I'm going to do that with a separate blueprint because I like modularity and being able to reuse stuff as we go through. And the easiest way to do that is to create a new blueprint. So we're going to VR templates, blueprints, and we might as well keep it all in the same place. So blueprint class, actor, I'm going to call this BP underscore any button to open level. And then we're going to open this up. So if you played around with Unreal before, you'll know that we can add components to our blueprints and we can go from there. We don't actually need to do any of that here. We're just going to go straight to our event graph and set some stuff up. So in this case, we don't actually need our actor begin overlap or event tick. We do want our begin play. And what we're going to do is we're going to get our player controller and we're going to enable input. So enable input. And what this does is on begin play, we're going to get our player controller and we're going to tell this blueprint. So we're telling this blueprint to listen to that controller. We want any input that's pressed to go through this blueprint. And we want to make sure get player controller is connected to the player controller, not the target, as the target is going to be self. And now what we want to do is right click and we want to search we want to search for any key. And that'll basically look for any key that's pressed when the level's open. And then we're going to do once. This is pretty much just a check to stop anyone from spamming the button, which would cause the screen fade to just like flicker and restart. And what we want to do is we want to get the player controller again. So our player controller contains our blueprint interface. So if we drag off this, we can actually search for vent fade to black. Actually, we can drag off this and search fade to black. And you see we get fade to black message. So we can tell this to fire something. So it's going to look at our player. It'll fire our event fade to black, which if we look at our player, our VR pawn, is our event fade to black. So in this case, whenever this blueprint is added to our scene, we're always going to fade and open a level. So should open level, we're going to set to true. And now we can actually add our level. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and promote a variable. And I'm going to search this level to open. And we'll leave this blank for now, but we will make this public so we can see it. So now we do control save. Everything looks great. So now if we go back to our health and safety screen, we can just drag in our BP any button to open level. Doesn't matter where it is, it just has to be in the scene and exist. Then we're going to set our level to open to be our motion controller, or our VR template actually. So we're going to right click, rename, just so we can be lazy and copy and paste that over. Paste that into our VR template, hit save and hit save current. So now if we jump in, when we put on our headset, we can see our health and safety screen. It's a bit low down. We could actually move this up. But the catch is, once we press any button, so if I press A on the keyboard, I got an error, so the easiest way to fix that is to actually use the correct target. So we want to get player pawn, not controller. So get player pawn. So now if we hit compile and save, we've got our stuff in the scene. We should be able to put our headset on. Oh, because I pressed the button, it actually skipped. We just hit play. And if I press the mouse button, it'll actually kick in. So we want to be in our level. And then when I press A or a mapped key, so I press left trigger, then it actually opened up our level. And you see that we fade in as well, which is exactly what we're after. The any key actually works based on literally the keyboard of the mouse, so you gotta be careful with that. But other than that, that's everything working. And you can see when we start, and I click, we actually fade into the other level as well. That's because it's all running through the VR pawn on the begin play. Let's delete you. Trying to debug. So it's all run through this. So we just hit compile and save. Close our project settings. And now if we open up our maps, we can go to VR template. So now that we're in the VR template, what you'll notice is we actually have a map already in here. So if we look at our VR player, so our blueprints folder, you'll see that we have a menu and we have a widget menu. The issue is when you're using the Oculus Quest, the inputs aren't set up correctly. It's mapped to the Oculus menu button. So when you press that, it opens up an overlay rather than actually opens the menu. So the first thing we're going to do is go to our project settings. Then I'm going to go to input. And you can see here we've got menu toggle left and menu toggle right. We're actually going to use the menu toggle left for this one. And what we're going to do is just change the Oculus Touch to Oculus Touch left, Y press. So for me, it'll be the Y button. For you, it could be anything you want. And you can make sure to add different controllers to this part if you need to. But for now, I'm just going to keep it like so. So if I save current, and then I press play and jump in, we'll see that I can press Y, and we get a menu pop up above our controller. And when we point at it, we can actually interact with what's there. But the issue is we can't see very well from our controller to our widget. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a widget pointer that works between both. And we're going to do some other stuff as well in this. So if you've already seen my video on creating dynamic widget pointer, this is going to be slightly different. And we're going to cover a little bit more stuff as well. Because at the minute, if we create a 3D widget and we place it into the scene, we wouldn't have our pointer interact with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to create this one instead. So if I open up this project, we can see that we've got a 3D pointer in here. What we can do is we can press play. It's a little bit laggy because I've got two versions of the engine open. But if I press the button, we get a pointer appear, so we can see where we're actually pointing at more effectively. And then if we turn right, at the minute our pointer disappears when we close our button. But what we can do is we can have it that if we get close to our widget, so we've got a computer screen or something in front of us, when we point at it, it'll actually spawn our widget interaction particle, and then it'll disappear after a couple of seconds. So we can interact with that, and then when we press our button, it spawns in, and then we can disappear them, or we can destroy those. So that's what we're going to cover now. And the first thing we're going to do is actually create a widget for us to use in our level. So I'm going to go to UMG, I'm going to right click and then user interface. We're going to create a widget blueprint, so WB underscore, let's just call this scene button for now, because we just need a reference to it. So I'm going to open this up, and then I'm going to drag in a button. I'm going to scale it up. And if you remember, we can center it by using 0.5, 0.5 on the alignment, and set our anchor point to centered, and then position X and Y to 0. We're going to hit compile and save. And now we can actually reuse our widget display by dragging it into the scene. And you can see it's got our health and safety on there. But if we select our widget on the right hand side, we can simply just drag on our custom widget or a button to our widget class. Now we can rotate, place in the scene. I'm going to scale it down a little bit. I'm going to place this into our scene here, like so. And one of the things with the UMG essentially in the new template is if we jump right in here now and we try to interact with the widget, it wouldn't actually detect us. So what we've got to do is open up our UMG widget, go to our widget component, and on the right hand side here we want to change a couple of things. Specifically, we want to change our collision preset. So we're going to open this up and we're going to set our collision preset to custom. We'll then go to select ignore all, so it changes our ticks. However, we want to put 3D widget to block. And hit compile and save. And now our line trace or our widget interaction will actually interact with that in the level. And while we're here, we can actually scroll up and I'll show you that if you're in the widget, if you're in the details panel with the widget selected, you can actually change the geometry mode as well. So you can select geometry mode to cylinder. And what that'll do is it'll actually curve our widget. So it's difficult to see because it's quite thin, but we can actually control the curve of what it is. So you can create like a HUD effect, and we can look at this later on. We'll do one in the scene, but it works quite well for curved monitors effects. So we're going to hit compile and save, jump in, and now that we've changed our widget to be custom with a collision of 3D widget, we can now interact with it. You will need to do this with all of your widgets if you have them in your scene, but we'll cover that. We'll cover this again, so it'll kind of remind you a bit more as we go through. So now what we're going to do is we're going to open up our VR pawn. So with our 3D widget in our scene that we can interact with now, what we can do is start setting up that pointer, and we're going to use Niagara for this. So by default, in our VR template folder, we have a VFX folder. We're going to right click, we're going to go to FX, and we're going to create a Niagara system. And here we have new system from selected emitters. We're going to hit next, and we're going to choose our dynamic beam, which comes with it. We're just going to hit the plus and then finish. So we can do NS underscore pointer beam. We're going to hit enter, and then we're going to open this up. So now we're in Niagara. Don't worry if you've never used this before. What we're doing is quite simple. We're just going to select our dynamic beam, and we're going to change some of the preset options already in here. So the first thing we're going to do is change our loop duration to 0.1. Actually, we'll do this at 0.01. We're then going to scroll down and change our spawn count to 0. And we'll see that our beam has disappeared. Don't worry about that. We're going to change our lifetime to 0.2. We're then going to change our lifetime to 0.2. And then we can actually modify our beam. So I'm going to delete So this is what controls the shape of our beam. I want it straight so it comes out the controller with a point at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the middle one and I'm going to delete that. And then using the mouse button, I can scroll around and I can select both of the pins. I'm going to right click while next to them. And I set this to linear. And what I can do now is I can actually drag these up. And this will control the thickness of our beam. We'll be able to see this clearly in a minute. Now we can keep going. So past our beam length or width, and then we can actually control the color here. So you can actually have full control over this if you want. I'm just going to leave this as the light blue. Actually, we'll just cancel. We'll leave this as default. And then I think for everything else, we are good. And what we want to do now is actually go over to the left here and go to user exposed. If you don't have access to this panel, you want to go to Windows and then search for parameters and then just give that a tick so it enables it. But what we want to do is press the plus and search for vector. So we got a vector. We're going to click this and we're going to call this beam end. This is going to be the value that we actually modify using our code to update the length of the beam. Makes it a little bit easier to see where it is and understand it. And what we can do is we can literally just select this and drag it onto our beam end value here. So where the green box is, we want to just drag and drop. And you see that now changes to user beam end. That means we've got control over this. And at the minute, our vector is set to 0, 0, 0. And we can see that by going to NS pointer. And it says here 0, 0, 0. What we want to do is we want to set the X to a default value. I do this around 30. I think it's just a nice value to have. And I realize our beam isn't showing because on selected dynamic beam, I have it set to spawn counter 0. I want that to be 2. And that'll give us a solid line, which we can see here on the left. And now you can actually see if we scroll out and we select our beams, we can actually change the length of this. So select both of them and then move these down. We'll see that our line or pointer changes thickness. And if we want to change the end value, we can move that down. And you can see that we get a point exactly how we want. But for now, I'm just going to leave this as 1 if it doesn't break. So let's set this to 0.2 and then 0.2. So we get a uniform size. We can hit compile and save. And then we can close this window down because we don't actually need any more. But what we do need is to go into our VR pawn, which is where we're going to do most of our code. So VR template, then blueprints, and open up our VR pawn. Let's find our event graph. And we want some free space. We're going to move down to the bottom here. So we got the code that we created earlier for our screen fades and level loads. We're just going to pick an empty space next to it to work from. So I'm right-handed, so I'm going to set this up so my menu spawns on my left hand and then my pointer spawns on the right. But I'll show you how you can swap those around if that's something you want to do later on. So the first thing we're going to do is start by creating 2 custom events. So I'm going to right-click, add custom event. Now if we scroll in, we're going to call this first one spawn pointer particle. If I can spell it correctly. And then we're going to right-click again, custom event, destroy pointer particle. And we're going to do this so we can keep our code organized because we don't want our pointer always on the screen. So we're going to have full control over when it's there and when it isn't. And rather than just setting the visibility, because that's bad for performance, we're going to actually destroy it so it doesn't exist. So I'm going to move these over here like so. And from our spawn pointer particle, we're going to do a do once. So from our spawn pointer particle, we're going to search do once. I'm going to line this up like so. And from here, we want spawn system attached. And what that'll do is it allows us to spawn a Niagara particle, which we just created, to our controller, which we're going to use. So we can select system template and we can use ns_pointer_beam, which is the one we created. And for our attached to component, we want to get a reference to our controller. And in my case, the pointer is going to be in my right hand, so I'm going to use the right controller. And we can actually get a reference to this from our components dropdown. So components, held motion controller right, we're going to drag that in, get, and then we can just simply connect that to our attach to component. And for our attach point name, we want to call this pointer. We haven't actually created this yet, and that's what we're going to do now so we don't forget. So we're going to hit compile and save, and then go back to our contents browser. And what we're going to do here is actually going to add a socket to our controller mesh. With this, it's good to keep in mind that this is global. So if you do it here, it will be in every other VR project that you make. So it might be worth duplicating the controls if that's something you want to do. But if you're not too worried and this is going to be something throughout the project, you can keep it this way. So what we're going to do is make sure we have on the right, we're going to make sure you guys can see it. We're going to show view options, then we're going to make sure show engine content is enabled and show plugin content is enabled. Currently this won't work on Unreal Engine 5 because the OpenXR folder that we're going to use isn't accessible yet. So just keep that in mind. And what you want to do is just scroll through this list till you find the OpenXR content. You want to select that and then devices. And this is actually all of the meshes and controllers that we have access to through OpenXR. So Unreal pretty much looks for your controller or looks for your HMD device. It'll work out what controllers you're using and then it'll update these models in the template. So based on whichever headset you're using, you'll have to go through and add this to the one you're doing. So for me, I'm using the Oculus Touch, Oculus Quest 2. So that is the Touch V3 controllers. And I'm specifically using the right controller. So I'm going to open this up. And what I want to do is make sure it's the Oculus Touch _V3 controller, not the right base. Because by default, OpenXR uses the longer one, the one with the longer name, basically is what I found. So you want to double click this and open it up. And like I said, this is global, so it carries on through other projects. So I've already got one here. But what you want to do is you want to create a socket and you want to name this pointer. So what I'll do is I'll delete this one. And then what you want to do is, with your mesh selected, you want to create a socket. If you don't see Socket Manager here, you want to go to Windows. And then I believe it's Developer Tools. Oh, no, if you go to Window and then Socket Manager, you can enable it there. But you just want to hit Create Socket and then call this pointer with a capital P. And then position this where you would like your particle or your pointer particle to be. So I'm going to disable grid snapping so I can move this around more freely. And then I'm going to move this down so it comes straight off the controller, like so, which is exactly what we want. So now we can do save and then return back to our VR pawn. Go through, blueprints, VR pawn. And now on our right controller, we have that socket called pointer. This is what this is looking for, and it's what it's going to attach to. We then want to change our location type to snap to target. We want to change it to snap to target and keep world scale. And an important thing that we want to do is make a variable or a reference to this pointer that we spawned. So when we spawn our pointer particle, we're going to spawn the particle effect and we're going to create a reference to it. So we can use this reference to control when we destroy it or other stuff that we want to do with it. So I'm going to call this pointer spawned. So we have a reference to it now. And now we're going to set up our destroyed pointer. So now we have a reference to it. We can actually drag in our pointer spawned reference. I'm going to get. Then we're going to check to see if that pointer or that variable is valid. So does it have something inside of itself? So basically, if it spawns something, it'll have something, then yes, we can destroy that. I'm going to drag this over because we need to make some room, like so. And then we want to drag off our pointer spawned and destroy component. Plug that into is valid. And now our destroy component is going to go into our reset. So once we've destroyed the particle that we've created, we can then create another one if we want to. And we're going to comment this. Spawn pointer and destroy pointer. So now that we have this set up, we can look at actually spawning our pointer particle. And to do that, we want to actually zoom out a little bit, and we want to look for this section here, which is input, action, menu left, and menu right. We want to make this a little bit bigger because we're going to move our left toggle over. So pretty much my button is on my left controller. So that's the one I'm going to be using here. If it's on your right, if you're inverting this, you would put this code on the right here. But what we want to do is drag off our toggle menu and search for a flip-flop. And from our A, we want to spawn pointer particle, followed by B to destroy pointer particle. And while we're here, we're actually going to create a bool because we need to access something later on. We need to know if this has actually been toggled. So I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call this is menu toggle with a question mark. And it doesn't matter what it is by default, we're just going to drag it in and set. So when we press the button, we're going to set it to true. And then when it's disabled, we're going to set this to false. Then we're going to hit compile. And by default, it should be false. So just make sure it is if you want to keep up properly. Now, if you were to test the project, you'll see that once we open up our menu, our widget pointer actually appears. So we press Y, our menu appears, and then we've got our pointer. And then once we close it, it deletes itself. So we can go between them. It's not currently doing the scale at the minute because we haven't set that up, and that's what we're going to do now. So in our graph, the first thing we'll do is find some free space. So we've got some over here. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a custom event. And I'm going to call this check pointer state. This could be update pointer scale or where it is, but it's going to do a little bit more than that. So we're going to actually call this check pointer state. First thing we're going to do is check to see if our pointer has been spawned. So pointer spawned, we're going to drag that in, we're going to get, and then we're going to drag off and search is valid if my Unreal doesn't bug out. So I'm going to compile and save, and I'll be right back. And now I'm back. We're going to do the is valid. So we want the one with the question mark. Plug that into our check pointer state. And now we want two branches. So I'm going to hold B on the keyboard, just create two of those. The top branch I actually want is the is not valid, and then the bottom branch to be is valid. Normally you would try and organize this the other way around, but when the code comes to it, it's actually cleaner to do it this way. And from our branch, we're going to spawn pointer particle, specifically our top branch from our true channel. And what we're going to do for our bottom branch from our true and false, we're going to drag off our pointer spawned. We're going to search set vector. And we want set Niagara variable vector 3, because that's what we've got. And we're actually going to create two of these and make sure that our targets are both on that spawn point. For our true, goes to the top one, and false to the bottom. And we want to make sure our in variable name is the same as the custom variable that we added to our Niagara pointer. So if I go back to VFX, pointer beam, and we select our pointer beam here, we can see it's beam end, so there's no space. We want it exactly like that. Have you? So beam end, and then the bottom one is going to be beam end also. And for the bottom one, while we're here, we just want to set our X value to 30. So that's going to be the minimum distance when you're not pointing at a widget of how big it'll go. So it kind of snapped back to being short. And what we want to do now is get our widget interaction right. So this one here from our right controller. Don't forget, if you're using your left controller for the particle, that would be the left controller. And then we want to get last hit result. And then we also want is over hit test visible, hit test visible widget. So if there's anything on screen, we're actually going to use this to say that we want to set our pointer to. And our is over hit test visible widget is going to go into both of our branches. And from our get last hit result, we want to actually break this. So drag off and search break hit result, and we're going to open this drop down. And we want to plug the distance into our X value. So at the minute, I haven't split it. So we want to right click, split, and from our X goes into our distance. We then want to go to our set Niagara variable vector 3, our bottom one from our false channel. We're going to drag off, and we'll create a branch. And this is where we're going to check to see if our menu has been toggled. So we want is menu toggled, plug in like so. And from our false, we want to delay, let's say 1 second. You can't change this. And then we're going to activate destroy pointer. So destroy pointer particle. So what's actually happening here? So at the minute, we're not actually firing our check state. We're going to do that in just a second. But what we are doing is we're checking to see if our pointer has been spawned and if it's valid. If it is valid, it means we've spawned our particle using our toggle menu left. So we want to spawn it, and then we're going to check to see if our hit test visible widget is true, and then we're going to control the length of that widget. If our pointer hasn't been spawned, but we're actually pointing at a widget in the world, we're going to hit true, and then we're going to spawn that particle anyway. So if we're not pointing at any widget, we won't have a particle. If we spawn our menu, we'll have a particle. If we destroy our menu, then it'll be destroyed. So this will make more sense in just a second. But what we actually need to do now is actually fire our checkpoint state. We could do a event tick, but there's no real reason to do that. We can clearly see that we don't have a event tick in our graph anywhere. So we're actually going to create a custom timer to fire this custom event here. So what we'll do is we're going to go to our event begin play. So we're going to scroll right to the top, and after our fade to scene, we're going to add in our timer. We're going to right click and set timer by event. And we're going to plug this in between. So on begin play, we basically create a custom timer, which we can control the length of. I'm actually going to set this to about 0.2. You can change this to be a bit higher. And we also want to set this to looping. So it is going to work as an event tick, but we can always turn it on or off if we want to later on. Now what we want to do is get our event, which is going to drag down and create event. And once we hit enter, you'll see that we get a fancy looking node that says create event, object self, signature, select function. In this case, we just want to select that custom event that we made earlier called check pointer state. So when we begin, we're going to fade to the scene. We're going to start the timer, and then it's going to look for the custom event, and it's going to just tell it to fire on loop. It only does it for what it's attached to. So it's not going to fire this every time. It will only fire this. So once we hit compile, we now have this all firing down here. And what we can do is we can select it all, and then we can comment it out. And I'm going to call this update pointer. So we hit enter, compile and save. We can actually jump into our VR template. And then when we have our menu, we spawn it, and we can see that it actually spawns in our scene. Once we close it, it disappears. But if we snap and we teleport over to this one, once we point at it, you see that we get our widget appear again. So we can actually interact with this now and do exactly what we want. And then if we come away, after a second, it'll disappear. So you can actually control this pretty well for what it is you're after. Cool. So the beam itself is a bit large. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our VFX, our pointer beam, and I'm just going to move this all down. So our beam width is currently at 0.2. Let's do 0.05. And for our last one, this might be the right one. Might have to change it around. I'm going to set that to 0, so it should go to a point. And once it loads, headset's bugging out. Let's just try and do this. Nope. So now we modified the pointer. If we jump in, we can actually spawn it. So it's a little bit thinner than normal, and I need to rotate the actual pointer. But we can see that we've got it working, and if we bring it away, it gets longer. And then as soon as we move off, it snaps back. And if we close the menu, it disappears. But if we teleport over to our button, we can point at it, and it comes back. And then we can actually hover over it. So at the minute, we can't actually interact with our button. And this is something else that we've got to fix now. So to help debug this, the first thing we're going to do is actually open up our button that's in our level, specifically our UMG. So I'm going to go to our widget. We're going to open this up. So we go to our health and safety widget. And in this case, that's not what we want. We want our scene button. So we're going to open this up and then select our button that's in our UMG. And now we can actually interact with this by creating an onClicked event. So we want to do onClicked. And then from this, we want to right click and we want to do print string. And we're just going to leave this as hello. This is going to help us debug and figure out what's going on. So by default, if we press play, once we hit this button or once we press our trigger, this should actually fire. So now we have our print string. I want to show you what's going on and why we can't interact with it. So by default, in the new VR template, we have a menu and we have our widget menu. So in our widget menu, there's actually very little in here apart from our restart button and exit button. But if we take a look at our menu, so if we open up the menu blueprint, you'll see that we actually have quite a bit of stuff going on. And what's actually going on here is once we open or toggle on the menu, we actually enable input inside of the widget or the blueprint itself. This is really good just for the menu itself, but in our case, we don't really want to do it this way. We're going to actually put our inputs, so these ones specifically, inside of our VR pawn. And we can do that really easily by just selecting these. So by default, in my case, I'm using the right controller, which has our widget beam. So we want our widget input action trigger right. So we're going to select our widget interaction reference. We're going to copy these over. So copy both of them. You'll see that it's a press pointer key and release pointer key with left mouse button. So what this is doing is basically when we press an input, in our case, we're going to choose trigger or grip. It will then mimic the left mouse button and allow us to control stuff. So now we've copied those three nodes. We might actually, all we really want is the press pointer key and release pointer key. So we're going to copy these, Control C, and then go over to our VR pawn. And we want to choose how we want to interact with these. And now we're in our VR pawn. What we want to do is we want to look for where we want to add these inputs. So in my case, I want it to be the trigger button because it just feels more natural. But what we want to do is make sure that we're not holding anything. So by default, we have set up inputs here. So trigger left and trigger right. In my case, I'm using trigger right because that's where my widget interaction is from. And what we can do is we can see here that we get an is valid check to see if we're holding something with our right hand. So in this case, if we're holding something with our right hand, we're not going to be able to interact with stuff because that hand's already got something in. So what we want to do is, if it's not valid, which means there's nothing in there, we can actually paste those in and we can press our pointer key. So it's not valid, we're going to press pointer key instead. And for our release, if there's nothing in our hand, so it is not valid, we're going to release pointer key. And for our target, we actually want to use a widget interaction right reference. So we want to drag that in, connect that up like so. Now we hit compile and save. So if we move these over a little bit just to organize this and tidy it up a little. We can then hit compile and save. And now when we play, we'll see that we still have our buttons. So if I hit restart, we restart the experience. Now I can press Y to bring back our menu. But if I teleport over by our button and we just point at it, we get our pointer the correct length. If we go off, after a second it disappears. But now we can actually press the trigger on our right controller and we can interact with that button. So that in itself is how you can interact with 3D widgets in the scene while also creating a dynamic pointer which will update based on what you're doing and how you're interacting with things. So it keeps the original workflow, but then it goes on to something a lot more nicer as a user experience, really. So if you want it to disappear quicker, you can just set this to 0.5. That'll do half the time. But for now, we're going to leave it there. And we're going to hit compile and save, and then jump back to our main menu. And now what we do is actually look at creating some 3D widgets in our scene that we can interact with a little bit more and do a little bit more stuff with. So cover UMG in total a lot more in depth.